I spent decades believing that the silence of this house at 70 would be the sound of my failure. I spent 35 years as a history professor, analyzing the rise and fall of civilizations, but I was blind to the slow decay of my own life. I thought that if I were a good father and a devoted husband, my reward would be a house filled with noise and grandchildren in my final years. I was wrong. I was deeply, dangerously wrong. I discovered that the real failure is not being alone. The real failure is waiting for someone else to fill the space that only you can occupy. My name is Arthur. I am 72 years old, and today I finally rule my solitude. It no longer rules me. I have learned that the dignity of an older man begins the moment he stops being a guest in his own home and becomes its master once again. But before we continue, I ask you please to help us bring this type of content by subscribing to the channel, liking the video, and leaving in the comments what you thought of the video. But before we proceed, I earnestly ask you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment from where you are watching. I remember how this house in Philadelphia used to breathe. My wife was the pulse of it. When she died 6 years ago, I did not just lose her. I lost my sense of direction. I retreated into these rooms like a wounded animal. I convinced myself that after 35 years of teaching the rise and fall of empires, I deserved to just exist. I lived in a state of suspended animation, wearing the same flannel pajamas for 3 days straight, because who was there to see me? I let the dishes pile up in the sink until the smell forced me to act. I was living on a diet of frozen meals and memories, thinking that this was what peace looked like. But the real lie was deeper. It was a poison I fed myself every single morning. I looked at the photos of Michael and my daughter on the mantle, and I told myself that I had built a fortress of love that would protect me in my winter. I believed in a silent contract. I thought that because I was a good father, because I paid for the colleges and stayed up through the fevers, that they would be my legs when mine grew weak. I spent hours staring at that black plastic phone on the wall, willing it to ring. I made excuses for Michael. I told myself he was busy with his executive job, that his silence was just the price of his success. I was a guest in a waiting room, waiting for a life that was already over to come back and save me. I see you doing it too. You keep that guest room ready for children who only visit on holidays. You keep the house exactly as it was when it was full, even though the silence now rings in your ears like a physical pain. You think that by staying small and quiet, you are being patient. But you are not being patient. You are being forgotten. I walked through these hallways like a ghost, touching the books I no longer read, waiting for a Sunday call that lasted 5 minutes and left me feeling more alone than before it started. I was a man who had mastered the history of the world, but had become a slave to his own expectations. I was waiting for a rescue team that was not even looking for me. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon exactly 6 months ago, and it was the day the lie I had been living finally shattered against the kitchen floor. I remember looking up at the ceiling light flickering like a dying star and feeling a sudden surge of uselessness. I did not want to wait for Michael to visit in 3 months to change a simple bulb. I was a man who had raised a family and taught thousands of students. Surely I could handle a wooden chair and a piece of glass. I dragged that old kitchen chair across the linoleum, and the screech it made echoed through the empty house like a scream. I climbed up, feeling the slight tremble in my knees that I chose to ignore. I reached up, and my fingers touched the dusty glass when the world simply gave way. The chair slipped, and I came down with a heavy, sickening thud that knocked the breath right out of my lungs. I lay there, staring at the underside of the kitchen table, with my cheek pressed against the cold, hard tile. My phone was sitting on the charger in the living room, just 30 feet away, but it might as well have been on the moon. I expected the pain to be the worst part, but it was the silence that truly cut me open. I lay there for 1 hour, then 2, watching the shadows of the afternoon sun crawl slowly across the cabinets. Every time I heard a car pass on the street, my heart would leap, thinking someone might stop, or Michael might have felt some fatherly intuition and decided to call. But the phone stayed silent. The house stayed silent. My hip burned, and my arm felt like lead. But the real agony was the realization that I had spent years building a temple to a family that was no longer there to catch me. I was 72 years old, lying in my own dirt and dust, and I finally saw the truth for what it was. I was not a patriarch being honored in his twilight. I was just an old man on a floor, and nobody was coming to help. That 4-hour stretch on the cold linoleum was the longest and most honest lecture I have ever received. It was the moment I realized that if I did not learn how to stand up on my own, I would eventually die exactly where I fell. After I finally crawled to that phone and dragged myself into bed, I spent the next month trying to negotiate with my own obsolescence. I did not want to admit that the world had moved on without me. I tried to buy my way back into my children's lives. I sent Michael $3,000 for a down payment on a car he did not even need, pretending it was a gift when it was really a bribe for a weekend of his company. I waited by the window for a car that never turned into the driveway. When he finally called, it was to tell me the money was nice, but they were too busy with soccer practice to come down for the summer. I felt the shame burn in my throat as I thanked him for the 10-minute conversation. I was a man who had taught the complexities of the Roman Empire, but I was acting like a beggar at my own son's table. I tried to hide the limp from the fall when Martha from next door stopped by. She spent 40 minutes complaining about her arthritis and how her daughter never visits, and I stood there nodding and pretending I was different. I told her I was enjoying the peace while my heart was screaming for a reason to wake up the next morning. I kept Michael's old bedroom exactly as it was 20 years ago, with the trophies on the shelf and the smell of stale air. I would go in there and sit on the edge of the twin bed like I was waiting for a ghost to come home and tell me I still mattered. I was clutching onto a version of myself that was already buried. I see you doing the same thing. You keep the pride like a shield, but it is really a cage. You tell yourself that you are being strong by not asking for help, but you are really just being stubborn while the walls close in. You think that by keeping the past alive, you are preserving your dignity, but you are only rotting alongside the memories. I spent weeks wearing that mask of the stoic old man while I was secretly terrified of the next time the light bulb would burn out. I was trying to solve a new life with old lies, and it was killing me faster than the age ever could. I was a king of a kingdom that had no citizens, and I was still trying to give orders to the empty chairs. It is a pathetic sight, and deep down, you know it because you see it in the mirror every single morning. I had to stop being a victim of my own expectations before I could ever hope to be a man again. I lay on that cold tile until the shadows reached the baseboards, and I finally understood that my life had become a lie. For years, I had been operating under a false contract. I thought that because I had been a good father and a stable provider, that the universe owed me a comfortable seat at the head of a busy table in my final years. I was wrong. I was waiting for a payment that Michael and my daughter were never going to make because they are busy building their own empires just like I once did. I saw my house for what it really was. It was not a fortress of love. It was a trap of my own making. I had let the dust and the dishes and the silence become my masters because I was too busy waiting for a rescue team that was never sent. I realized that the real failure wasn't being alone, but being alone and waiting for someone else to fill the space that only I can occupy. My dignity had been slowly leaking out of me with every day I spent in those flannel pajamas waiting for a phone call that only lasted 5 minutes. I understood right then that I had to kill the man I was to become the man I needed to be. I had to stop being a guest in my own home and become its ruler once again. I had to accept the most brutal truth of all, which is that no one is coming to save me. Old age is an individual sport, and the only coach I have is the man staring back at me in the reflection of the oven door. I dragged myself up not just to my feet, but back into my life. I decided that this house would no longer be a cell where I wait for death, but a temple where I practice the art of living on my own terms. I finally saw the truth. If you want to keep your self-respect, you have to stop begging for it from people who are too busy to give it. You have to take it back for yourself. I realized that domestic disorganization is what turns a home into a cage, and I was done being the prisoner. It was time to stop surviving and start commanding the silence. I had to stop the bleeding of my own dignity. I had to create a method because without it, I was just a man waiting for the end. I realized that living alone is not a passive state of being, but an active exercise in sovereignty. If you do not rule your house and your hours, they will eventually crush you. I started with 4 simple rules that cost me nothing but gave me back the keys to my own life. The first thing I changed was the uniform of my defeat. I made a rule that I will never stay in my pajamas past 8 in the morning. To you, it might seem small, but to me, those pajamas were the white flag of surrender. When you stay in your nightclothes, you are telling your reflection that you have nothing worth dressing for. You are telling the world that you are already a corpse that just has not stopped breathing yet. Pajamas are for the sick and the dying, and I decided I was neither. Now I dress as if I am expecting a guest of the highest honor every single day. That guest is me. I put on a clean shirt, I lace my shoes, and I look in the mirror because a man who is dressed for the day is a man who still has a mission. Then I looked at the physical traps I had set for myself in this house. I realized that my home was still designed for the man I was 20 years ago, and that was a dangerous mistake. I spent a whole afternoon bringing everything that was high down to my eye level. I moved the heavy cast iron pans from the top cabinets to the bottom drawers, where I do not have to strain to reach them. I threw away that wobbly wooden chair that nearly cost me my life on the kitchen floor. Organizing your home for your current physical reality is not an admission of weakness. It is an act of supreme intelligence. If you are still climbing ladders to reach a box of cereal, you are not being brave. You are being a fool. A sovereign ruler does not risk his kingdom for a light bulb. You must engineer your environment so it works for you instead of waiting for it to break you. I also realized that my voice was beginning to sound strange to my own ears because I went days without using it. This is how the mind begins to fail. So I instituted a policy of mandatory micro-socialization. I forced myself to speak to at least 3 strangers every single day. I walk to the coffee shop and ask the barista how her morning is going. I talk to the librarian about a new biography. I comment on the weather with the man at the pharmacy. This is not about making friends, and it is not about being lonely. It is about keeping the machinery of your mind from rusting shut. Isolation is a slow poison that atrophies the soul. And if you do not force yourself into the world will happily let you disappear. You must keep your social faculties active, or you will lose the ability to think clearly. Finally, I started what I call the sunset inventory. Before the light fades from the living room windows and the night settles in, I sit down and define exactly what I will do tomorrow. I write it down on a yellow legal pad. Wake up at 7, breakfast by 7:30, garden for 1 hour, clean the hallway. This simple list eliminates the suffocating anxiety of waking up without a purpose. That empty space in the morning is where the depression creeps in, and it is where the feeling of uselessness takes root. When you plan your day, you are commanding your time instead of letting it slip through your fingers like dry sand. You are the master of your schedule, or you are its victim. There is no middle ground in this house anymore. I still feel the ghost of that cold tile against my cheek every time the sun begins to set. It was a 4-hour lesson in the brutal math of existence. 4 hours of waiting for a love that had already moved to a different state and a different life. I am telling you this because I see the way you look at the door. I see how you flinch every time the mail slot rattles, hoping for a letter that is not there. Stop waiting for the world to remember you exist. Your children are not villains for living their lives, just as you were not a villain for living yours when you were their age. But they are not your lifeboats. You are drowning in a sea of your own expectations, and you are doing it in a house that is slowly becoming your tomb. Do not wait for a fall to learn how to stand up. Do not wait for the silence to become deafening before you finally decide to speak. The time for being a spectator in your own decline is over. This is not a suggestion, and this is not a gentle piece of advice from an old professor. This is a command from a man who almost died waiting for a phone call that was never going to come. Get out of that chair right now. Do not wait for tomorrow morning, and do not wait for the perfect moment. Go to that closet you have not opened in 3 years and throw away the things that no longer serve the person you are today. Clean the dust from the shelves. Lace up your shoes. Reclaim your territory. Your home is either a castle where you reign with dignity or a cell where you rot in silence. And the choice of which one it is belongs entirely to you. You still have breath in your lungs and blood in your veins, which means you still have a duty to yourself. Take back your life before the shadows take it from you. Stand up. Be the master of your own house again. Do it now, before the light fails for good.